This is the first of a series of Sawyer seminars this semester, and so as we mentioned last week, we want to have maybe there's a pre-circular paper, then 20-25 minutes presentation, and then at least one person volunteering to kick the thing off as a discussant. So Şahan will be the discussant this time. We'll be looking for other discussants throughout the semester, and let's get started.
Okay.
Let me give you the floor.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Am I in the way?
No, you need to change it from, that's the computer to change, okay.
What are you talking?
Yes,
Okay,
I mean,
well then somebody should do it for
Yeah.
him.
No, wait a minute.
The computer's just there to record
You can use
Oh.
that and I can.
Oh, I see.
And
No, I
hope
don't
we
get,
can
I
edit
don't
the
understand
recording.
what's happening at
No, I can edit that.
all. Is there a little thing to push? I'm just gonna point to you.
Yeah, okay.
Go to the next slide.
You can also put there.
Yeah, okay, this is just an outline of what I'm gonna say, but let me, did everybody get the handout? Because the outline's on the handout and missing stuff to read. Beverly sent around a paper. How many of you had a chance to look at that? Okay, some of you did. It's a little confusing because actually I'm not really gonna talk about that paper, but I will answer questions about it, and it is kind of the framework for what I am gonna talk about. Beverly mentioned that I study world systems over the long run since the Paleolithic. Okay, I'm kind of more of an anthropologist at this point than a sociologist. But it's really, it's social science because it's the study of human sociocultural evolution. And so how did the institutions that we take for granted in the modern world come about, and how were they invented, and how did they spread, and all this, and I study it over the long run. Today, I'm mainly going to be talking about social movements, and the big insight here from an anthropological perspective is social movements have been important all along. They were also important in the Stone Age. Okay, so social movements aren't something that just happened in the 19th century. They are if you define it narrowly enough and say it's a bureaucratically, but if it's a bunch of people who decide that somebody has a new idea and they're all gonna argue about it, and then some of them are gonna run off and do something new, come up with a new notion of how the universe is constituted or which gods we're gonna worship and stuff. Social movements have been around all along. Religious movements are social movements, okay? And that's social change at the conscious end has been about this all along. And hunter-gatherers do it too. I know a lot about indigenous people in California, and you can see social movements operating in a system of sedentary foragers. Okay, these are people who are hunter-gatherers, they live in villages, but there are waves of new dances and new ways of thinking about the powers of the universe that sweep across linguistic groups and stuff like that. So social movements are part of social change from the beginning and sociocultural evolution. People are inventing new institutions and new ways of thinking about the nature of the universe and what's right and what's wrong and all that, and they're arguing about it. And the big idea in the modern world system, which I'm now going to talk about, stop talking about California before the Europeans got there, is that the structure of the system, the institutional nature of it, the power relations, have evolved because people rebel and fight against hierarchies, and that this has been going on for hundreds of years, and the term that we use for this is world revolutions. This is the world system idea about how politics operates at the level of the world system. There are periods in which there's a lot of rebellions, and sometimes those rebellions are linked to one another causally, sometimes they're linked to one another by the people who are rebelling or interacting with one another, sort of. But it's the powers that be who know about this and who have to deal with the problems that rebellions create. And rebellions cluster together in time, and they have characters. They're dealing with problems that exist in a particular world historical time period. So that's the idea of a world revolution. It's different from a national or a local revolution because it's a bunch of rebellions that occur in the world system at the same period of time. And increasingly, world revolutions get linked up with one another because communications technology and transportation technology, make it easier for people to communicate with one another. And that the structure of the system, the systemic cycles of accumulation, the changes in the way capital and administrative power work evolve because the powers that be have to deal with these rebellions from below, and this is a cycle that's been going on for hundreds of years. Okay, and we list these things according to sort of the symbolic year. So the Protestant Reformation, which was a religious revolt that took place in Europe, was linked strongly to the rise of the Dutch hegemonic period and systemic cycle of accumulation. Okay, the Dutch Revolution was, the ideology of it was about Protestantism and so on, and there was a big fight going on about religion within Europe that transformed the way the economy worked ultimately and the way the polity worked. And the other ones are given dates. 1789, you've all heard about that one, but it wasn't just in France. It was the Haitian Revolution. Okay, it was the American Revolution. It was a revolution that occurred in a lot of places. World revolutions doesn't mean it happens everywhere. It means it happens in a lot of places, and that they're somewhat linked. They have to do with stuff that's going on geopolitically and economically in the system. 1848 is a fascinating example of this. That I mean, when we read about the World Revolution of 1848, it's mostly about Europe, but the Taiping Rebellion was part of the World Revolution of 1848. Okay, this guy thought that he heard about Christianity and he kind of made up his own version, and he thought he was Jesus' brother and all this stuff, and it was this huge big rebellion in China. What was happening in China was there was a cycle of dynasty formation and peasant revolt that had been going on for a long time, and it was starting to get linked up to the cycle that was going on in the West, and the Taiping Rebellion was part of that. In the United States, it was all these new Christian sects that emerged in upstate New York at the same time, including Mormonism and all this stuff. Joseph Smith was a communist, I know you all know this. The same issues that were radical ways of rethinking that were part of 1848 were happening in the United States, and for similar reasons, and people were coming up with new forms of sort of white people community, which was this Christian sect stuff. And you know, they were coming up with all kinds of new ideas and so on, and it was this huge big thing that happened. It was the version the way that it occurred in the United States, and that was linked to what happened in China, because the guy that the Christian ideology that they got in China was some preachers from Tennessee who happened to be in Guangzhou, and some pamphlets were translated into Chinese, and this guy that lived out in the country read this thing and kind of made up his own Chinese version of Christianity. So, but it was really just a repeat of these earlier cycles in China. Anyway, world revolutions are happening, and the evolution of the system, its expansion, its scale, and the deepening of capitalism and so on is in part a reaction to them. The U.S. period of domination of the world is a reaction to the World Revolution of 1917 to some extent. Okay, the Cold War and all that stuff, and the ability of the United States to do what it did is in part a response to the challenge that was posed by the World Revolution of 1917. Obviously the communist states and all that, but the social movements too, the labor movement and so on. So the idea here is there's kind of a structure. The simple idea is there's a structure at the world system level that evolved, but it evolves because people rebel against it. And that in order to succeed and be the center and have power, you got to deal with that. And it's a competition among elites, and it's the ones who do it the best, who deal with the problem the best, who end up being maintaining their position or gaining new position. So it's a kind of a functional notion of how it works. Now, I want to talk about what's going on now. Okay, the World Revolution of 2011, I call it. Okay, there's another one. What is the best year and all that? I don't know, but 2011 is pretty good because a lot of stuff happened then. And I want to think about the new global left and how it's similar or different from earlier global lefts. And I'm mainly going to be comparing it with 1848 and 1917, but 1968 and all that is important for understanding what's happening now. So the evolutionary comparison I want to deal with now is kind of, okay, what is going on in terms of rebellion and revolution in the world, and how is it compared, how has the situation changed, or how is it similar, and what is the structure of the movements and their relationship with one another, with each other. So that's the subject today. How am I doing on time?
Oh, you've got
You use all my
15,
time?
now you got 15 minutes.
Okay. And within that topic, I'm going to focus on, I'm trying to figure out how to understand the potential of the social movements for collaboration and the formation of cooperation among social movements so that they can actually have an impact on the powers that be. That's the problem, okay, that I'm working on. I'm working on this for a while, done some research on it, and I'll tell you where I am now. Okay, I already talked about all that, I think. Pretty much. I didn't talk much about 68 and 89, but frankly, you've got to understand 68 and 89 to understand what's going on now. So it is important. Okay, 68 is students all over the place. Sometimes some workers too in some countries. But it was a world revolution. Okay, it was different from 1917 because what had happened after World War II was the creation of a new class of people, university students, because of the expansion of higher education all over the world, following the US model and the UN model, okay? Every country had to have a university system, and it created this class of people, students, who were politically unincorporated, pretty much, and were being impacted by what was going on in the world, which was the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, and responding to that by doing what movements do, rebelling and causing trouble and so on. I know because I was there. I was in Berkeley in 1964. We stopped the war.
That's a little help from the Vietnamese.
That's true. The Vietnamese played an important role too.
But mostly you.
89 was, we think of it as the fall of the Soviet Union, but it was more than that, right? And it had an influence on this thing that I'm going to be talking about the new global left. Because the new global left is a moving, it evolves, it's a different thing. 68 put a bunch of stuff in place that we're still living with. Elements that are very important in the ideology of the people who are, the ideologies of the people who are rebelling. 89 did too, because in the West, anyway, people came to understand that civil rights are not just a bourgeois ideology, okay? Civil rights are actually pretty important. And habeas corpus and all that stuff we also, as legitimations for capitalism, are important whether or not they're legitimations for capitalism. And the Patriot Act and everything makes this kind of obvious, but 89 sort of brought that home, okay? People realized, like, wait a minute, that is what the problem is with the Soviet system. Okay? They don't have that, and it is a good thing. All right, I talked about, now, that paper that some of you read is trying to figure out what the alternatives are, how the current world situation is different or similar from before. So it's the evolutionary project. But the big idea here is that capitalism is in crisis again, and there are neoliberal capitalism is in crisis, blah, 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 and there are some logical alternatives that are kind of obvious, but they don't seem to be happening much. Okay, there's a kind of the neoliberals seem to still be in control. They're doubling down on austerity and all this kind of stuff. But there are some people in the global capitalist class that are saying, wait a minute, this is probably not going to work much longer, and we should do something else. I'm thinking about George Soros and the potential for a kind of a New Deal on a global scale, like global Keynesianism and stuff. And those people do exist, but they haven't really gotten any traction yet. But the notion here is that as things continue to fall apart, it's possible that those people will be able to bring something off on a global scale and kind of save the day for capitalism. And the alternative is chaos, and the whole thing comes down, big grid sinks, we can't make our cell phones work anymore, and then something else emerges. Probably doesn't kill all the humans. But, okay, so there are possibles for radical transformation or another systemic cycle of capitalist accumulation, right? Either of those things could happen in the next few decades. And the next few decades is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about 1,000 years from now, okay? Although I'm interested in that too, but for today, let's stick with the next few decades. So we're talking about the potential for the future. And I'm thinking either global Keynesianism or something more, global socialism, say, could happen. It depends on how bad the crises are and how much the perfect storm happens and all that. Okay? If financial collapse and ecological disaster and everything all happen, and inter-imperial rivalry all happen kind of at the same time, you could have a real serious meltdown, way more serious than anything that's happened yet, which would then be a big opportunity, frankly, for those survivors to do something different. And that's when big changes occur, in the past and probably in the future. Okay? The big changes are a response to huge crises. However, there's also another alternative, which is just a sort of rational, sort of global Keynesian solution. Okay, this is not rocket science. It's known how you can solve the problem. It's just you've got to put people back to work and so on, which requires the investment of resources to do it and so on. It's all been done before. It happened before. It could be done again. The difference is it was done nationally before, but it could be done globally. Whether that will happen or not, and what I see is this as a struggle between Dick Cheney and George Soros here. Dick Cheney is sort of doubling down on austerity and military solutions to everything and zap you if you don't like it. And George Soros is not. He's a global Keynesian kind of guy, although he's not that explicit about what it is that he wants to do, but his heart is there. And that whether the notion here, which is in the World of Revolution literature, is that what happens in world revolutions is the revolutionaries don't get what they demand. But what they do get is something that was demanded in an earlier world revolution. And that there are enlightened conservatives, George Soros, who realize that they've got to make some compromises and they can't have everything the way they wanted it. And so they cool people out, basically, cool out the revolt by giving them something that a lot of people now think would be a good idea. So there's a notion of enlightened conservatives, and I think those people do exist now. But the point I would make is whether you get that or not, to some extent, depends on the social movements. That the muscle and the effectiveness of the social movements in pushing the powers that be is a big factor in what happens. Okay, so that's why it's of interest to me to look at the potential of the global left to really be able to affect world politics. Okay, in other words, to get its act together and not just be a place where we go on vacation and gap with each other, but actually have instruments that can have an effect on world politics. Okay, I call it muscle. Now, this thinking that way requires dealing with a bunch of issues that are the sort of fallout of earlier world revolutions and the ones that I've already mentioned. And there's a whole bunch of issues. The paper is kind of about this. It's like more about what's similar and what's different between, especially in the transition that's going on now versus what happened when the British hegemony went down. And the big idea here is, one big difference is ecological, okay? That when the British hegemony went down, oil was coming up. And it created a lot of possibilities that we no longer have. Okay? The fossil fuel thing is going to be a major challenge for us. And that's a real big difference between now and the end of the 19th century. All right, let me see. Okay, I did at the University of California, Riverside, we've done a bunch of surveys of meetings of the World Social Forum. The World Social Forum is a good place to go study the new global left, because that's pretty much what is going on there. Okay, it's a venue for grassroots movements all over the world. Now, there are big problems with it. It's held, the global meetings are held at a particular place. It's expensive to get there. Not everybody can afford to fly to Brazil. But there are efforts made to overcome that. One of the ways they do it is by moving the thing around. They had one in Nairobi. They had one in India. What we did was do surveys of the attendees of the World Social Forum. Okay, so we did this in Port of Lake Ray in 2005 and in Nairobi in 2007. We also studied the U.S. Social Forum, which is met in Atlanta and in Detroit. But today I'm just going to be talking about the results from the World Social Forum. Although, interestingly, they're similar. Okay, what we do is we ask people, we give them a list of 25 movements, and we say, which of these are you actively involved in? And they check them off. Okay, and from that we can see, based on individuals being active in more than one social movement, what the network of social movements looks like, just based on individual participation. Okay, so we've got 500 respondents and 20 movements, and they all not rank the movements, they all check off the ones they're actively involved in. This is the result. Okay, what we find out is there's a network of movements, and some of them are more central than others. It's a multi-centric network. It's hierarchical, as we say. There's more than one center. But there is also hierarchy, because some are more central than others, okay? And all of them are linked with the others. The reason these ones are up in the corner is because in order to do network analysis, you have to do a cutting point, unfortunately. And we rate the bar of the cutting point was high enough. But if you actually look at the matrix of connections, all of these movements, including the anarchists and the communists and queer rights and national liberation, were linked to some other movements. So there were no zeros in the matrix of connections. Okay, all movements among the people that we surveyed, 500 people more or less, are linked to some other movement. So there's really no isolates. So there's a single network, and it is centralized. And the ones in the middle are human rights, environmental, peace, global justice, and this was in 2005 in Port Lake Ray. But we also did this in 2007 in Nairobi, and the network is pretty much the same. Okay, and it's pretty much the same when we study it within the United States. So, what's going on here is human rights. No big surprise. Everybody kind of agrees about human rights. It's part of the. It's part of the European Enlightenment or something, okay? I mean, there's some people that are, that's not a good idea, but not very many. Now, it's also pretty vague as to what it means. There's a million kinds of human rights, there's collective human rights, but it means something, because you ask people what are you actively involved in, and a huge number of them are actively involved in that, and it's central in linking the other movements. Okay? Now, what this shows is there's a network, like people call it the movement of movements, and that there aren't factions in it, radical factions, I mean separate groups operating, and that there's potential for collaboration and so on here. But it doesn't tell us much beyond that in terms of the potential for collaboration, and that's the thing I'm interested in. So what I'm trying to do now, okay, this is about issues that have come up in these movements that have to be dealt with, that you can't ignore if you're studying these social movements. and they involve, there's a lot of problems, okay? Because people don't agree about all this stuff, and because some of the ideological elements that are very strong create big obstacles. Okay, we have a lot of people in the new global left who are autonomous and anarchists and so on, and they don't want to participate in politics as usual, I mean, they won't vote for anything. This all comes out of 1968 and a reaction to the old left and all this stuff. And this is big, okay? There's no way to just ignore that. We've got to deal with that. There's also the issue of individualism. The old left sort of had this critique of capitalist individualism and so on, but the new left is, we need to think about types of individualism and notions of socialist individualism and so on. I've been reading David Graeber lately, so sort of, you know, trying to figure this out. There's a lot of things that are sort of carryovers from earlier social movements that create problems, political problems, and that we do have to, we can't just ignore. The idea I'm thinking about is a united front or global party formation, but we can't use the word party because the new left doesn't like parties because the old left had parties and parties are bad. So we have to call it something else. Don't call it a party, call it a network, call it something. But whatever you want to call it, it's an instrument that allows people to coordinate their behavior with one another, okay? Whether it's hierarchical or horizontal or not, frankly, I don't care, but there's a huge big debate about that too. In the simple version, the old left was a bunch of hierarchical institutions. Actually, this is based not on the actual historical knowledge of what happened in the old left, but sort of what the old left became, 40 or 50 years later. And that part is correct. But there's a lot of back and forth about this, about forms of organization stuff, which is very important. We can't just ignore it. What I'm doing now, I'm out of time.
Yeah, but go ahead and finish your.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is I'm trying to figure out, I'm working with a guy named Patrick Bond, who's David Harvey's student who works at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa, and we're trying to figure out how to do research on the problem that I raised, okay? And of course the problem is we want to study the future, but it's pretty hard to study the future, so we can't do that. We've got to, we're constrained to study the past. But what I'm thinking is there's a number of ways to go about this. I'm also working with a sociologist named Bill Carroll, who's at the University of Victoria. What Bill has been doing is going around and studying left think tanks. Patrick Bond says I can't call them think tanks, but I forgot what he told me to call them. But think tanks is bad. Bill's been doing this, okay? He's been traveling around for about a year, going to the Transnational Institute and there are these left think tanks that are spread out, okay? And ideas come out of them. So in order to understand how ideas influence what's going on politically, it is important to study them. Patrick Bond studies grassroots movements, and he's involved in grassroots movements. And the thing I've been reading, what I realize is we should look at success stories that already exist. Okay, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but let's see how it worked when trans movement groups came together and new tendencies emerged and so on. And how did it actually happen? Was it think tanks that invented new ideas? Was it grassroots movements that bubble up from below? Where did the ideas come from? And then where did the people come from? And then how did it actually work? And pick a bunch of cases, and the one I'm working on now is the one Patrick Bond is involved in, which is the climate justice movement. Okay, and I've just been reading his history of the climate justice movement, and it's fascinating. The climate justice movement is neat because it involves a lot of different things, a lot of different movements. Okay, it links them, and that's the kind of thing I'm interested in. Okay, I'm looking for things that do that. And I would like to do even more than the climate justice movement does, but at least let's go see how that emerged. And basically I've been reading his history of it, and it looks like it's kind of in part, okay, it comes out of the environmental justice movement, which was basically grassroots movements trying to deal with the environmental problem, but with its social implications, which is that it's affecting some people way more than others. So they're dealing with issues of race and class and all this stuff. And then the climate justice movement kind of comes out of that one, and it's a response, obviously, to the climate crisis. Anyway, this is where I am now. I'm trying to study that particular movement, but there's other interesting phenomena that I want to compare it to. And I'm working with Patrick Bond, and he's an activist in the climate justice movement. But I don't know if any of you know anything about that, but I'd be interested in talking to you about it. So the strategy at this point is to sort of trace the history of a bunch of these, and then try to figure out what they have in common or how it's different, and then, but also do that in the context of thinking about what the potentials for a united front are. And I've been reading this book by Paul Mason, and what he's pointing out is, you know, the left doesn't get itself together. It just continues to fragment until things are really bad. And what happened in the 30s that created the United Front and Popular Fronts and stuff was the rise of fascism. And there are things like that now. So it could be that, you know, but even if that's true, it still might make sense to do the former thing and see how these processes emerge. Because what bad stuff, contention in oppositional counter-hegemonic politics creates is basically turns up the gas. And then you get to see, well, who are the people who are willing to work together with other people and make counter-balance and stuff like that. So, but that should be related to what's already happened. All right, I'm going to stop. I'm out of time.
One more slide? Or that's the slide?
There it is.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you very much. So we're going to ask Şahan to kick off. I said, give him, well, I don't know, find out how long he talks. And then we'll just immediately open up so then we, and then get to Chris, who's, well, you're doing okay. You need water or something? You got water. You got water. You're okay. Okay, good. Poor guys came in the rainstorm and the thunderstorm yesterday and on California time, and then did Dan's GBO this morning for 2 hours. So that's good.
Okay, thank you. It's a great honor to be here in the first of the Sawyer seminar speaking series and to be discussing Professor Chase-Dunn's first paper called The Crisis of What? The End of Capitalism or Another Systemic Cycle of Capitalist Accumulation, and his talk, The Global Left, United Fronts in the World History and Future. And Professor Chase-Dunn has always been a great source of inspiration for me and for many graduate students here at Hopkins, so it's a great honor to see him here. And today what I will try to do is I will try to open the floor for debates and discussions, and I will provide my response to his presentation and his paper first. So I will be referring to the presentation and the paper simultaneously for that matter. I think both in the talk and in the pre-circulated pattern, Professor Chase-Dunn brings together a number of different but closely related things about the possible trajectories of the evolution of capitalism and global governance in the near future, in the 21st century. But I think there are three key arguments in his overall presentation. One is that he underlines that there is an interactive and dynamic relationship between the evolution of capitalism and global governance and movements, rebellions, revolts, revolutions from below. And these movements are not simply a reaction to capitalism and to the forms of global governance, but they also transform these systems. So in a way, he describes this as a positive feedback kind of loop, which creates this kind of spiral in the long history. And he says that's why we can observe the clusters of world revolutions, which not only emerge as a response, but they also transform the world. There's a second integral part of this process. It's not in his talk, but in the paper it's one of the integral issues. It's about the role of semi-peripheral, the semi-peripheral development in this, because he argues that semi-peripheral locations are fertile grounds for creating these transformative changes. for anyone who would like to implement organizational, ideological, technological changes, the notion of semi-periphery and the semi-peripheral locations are key, actually. And the third argument is that the movements which challenge the existing order, existing hegemonic order, or existing order, they are not homogeneous. They can be counter-hegemonic, they can be reformist, they can be anti-systemic, they can be revolutionary, they can be progressive or reactionary. So that's why the organizations of these movements, the composition of them, and the alliances they make are critical because they are going to shape the structures of capitalism and they will shape the forms of global governance. So that's why in his talk he's specifically looking at the kind of like what is happening in terms of the organization of these movements is the key. And there's a very bold argument in his and today's presentation and the paper, and that's a very bold and important argument, I think. He says 2011 wave of unrest, and taken together with, if we take it as a larger wave, of course, not simply the year 2011, but it must be seen as one of the world revolutions, like 1789, like 1848, like 1917, 1969, and 89. So it is one of the world revolutions, and that's an important, bold claim because, I mean, many people say, oh, okay, something is happening, but there are not many people now who say, okay, this is one of the world revolutions. And I think I agree with that. We are living in a moment, I mean, which can be categorized as the world revolutions and which has its transformative nature. That's why the problem he's putting on the floor is a very important one to understand what's going to happen in the near future. But I will have some discussions about the similarities and differences he presents. But first, I will start with something that it was not in the talk, but in the paper, because that's the way we must look at the 2011 wave of unrest. For instance, what does this wave of unrest tell us about the hypothesis of semi-peripheral development? Because actually, if we look at the key locations of the 2011 wave, and if you look at in the paper, if you look at Professor Chase-Dunn's classification of the core semi-periphery and the periphery on page 8, like let's say the locations of the Arab Spring, Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Syria, Iran, Libya, these are not peripheral locations. These are actually, I mean, semi-peripheral locations. These are actually peripheral locations. But of course, if we take it in a larger way, then Professor Chase-Dunn also says, okay, there's an issue of timing here. These movements, these waves started in the semi-periphery in Latin America in the 1990s, so it was the main location, and then the periphery joined in. So it's in a way spread to that. But it's not simply a spread to periphery, because also one of the key issues in this 2011 wave of unrest is the return of these revolts and revolution back to the core. We saw the London riots, we saw the Occupy, we have been talking about the workers' unrest and the workers' movement in French banlieues. So in a way, one of the distinguishing features of this is actually the revolts have turned back to the core as well. So in a way, and I agree that semi-peripheral locations are key historically in the creation of these transformative moments. But today, actually, what we see is that it's a broader, a system-wide combination of revolts and revolutions. And it creates lots of questions about like what's happening. For instance, how come the revolts and revolutions return back to the core? Because, I mean, again, in the paper, one of the key arguments in that the core countries will have greater capacities to contain these revolts and rebellions from below, because actually their class structure is like a pyramid-shaped class structure with large middle classes, and actually also they can use the returns from imperialism to take the consent of the masses in a way, right? There's this argument. But in a way, when we look today, assuming that this argument is correct historically, today something is happening, because one of the key arguments about what's happening in terms of the revolts in Europe and in North America, here in the United States, is the talk about the decline of the middle classes. So, for instance, according to Slavoj Žižek, he says, okay, why are these revolts happening? Oh, it's because of the revolts of the salaried bourgeoisie. And also, like Paul Mason's argument regarding the graduates without, featured unemployed graduates is also based on that. And like guys standing prices, precariat, declining middle classes. So, and also, not simply that, but also in terms of the return to imperialism, this American hegemonic cycle, it seems to be an exception for that. Because previously it's right, if we compare it to the previous long century with the British hegemony, it is right that actually British imperialism, the British imperialist expansion, was a response to emerging labor unrest, in United Kingdom, and it's also like when Lenin is referring to Cecil Rhodes' argument, so we have to be imperialist if we want to avoid civil war. It's the response to that. But today what's happening in this era of imperialism without colonies, they say, it seems that these new imperialist policies engaged by this declining hegemon, I mean, it's just, when they engage, they're losing all of these financial resources completely, and there's not enough resource to even buy the consent of the masses, rebellious masses. That's the problem with the United States. So in a way, some of the dynamics actually that is occurring today in the 2011 wave of unrest is, I think, in a way, not simply a repetition of the previous cycle, something new is happening. It's about the capacities of the capitalism to take the consent of the masses as a whole seems to be declining, because the same argument is also can be applied to the periphery. But because, I mean, today that's not the core issue, I would like to come to the main issue that Professor Chase-Dunn put on the floor, and it's about the organizational structure of these movements. And admittedly, first of all, I think that's very important, because many people who engage in the long historical analysis of social movements, they do not look at the organizational structure and the alliances they make, right? So Professor Chase-Dunn has this long historical perspective starting from the Stone Age, but looking from today, he says, okay, let's look at the composition and the alliances. And I think we should recognize it as an important intellectual, in a way, shift. And I agree about what he sees in these new global movements. In a way, he says that we see a multicentric horizontal structure in the global left. There's this beginning of this leaderlessness. I mean, in a way, they have this. And in many ways, this trend is opposite to the trend that we have been seeing in the 19th century. In the 19th century, if you look at the evolution of organization of the global left, the internationals and this and that. Actually, originally it was like that. Originally, it was a composition of the anarchists and the socialist labor movements, unions, and it started like this kind of a coordination dialogue. But if you look at the trajectory in the 19th century, what was happening is that throughout all of these struggles, there was a double tendency, which were going to vertical organization, so professionalization, professional organization, parties, international. Even the whole debate between the Second International and the Third International was that, this is not simply a platform to discuss. We need a party to intervene and this and that. And also, in a way, there was an ideological, in a way, clarification. Everyone was trying to separate each other from, we are the communists, so we are not. So Bolsheviks are separating from the Mensheviks, and so that was the key, in a way. So today, the new left is, in a way, and when we look, in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, we see this coming revolts and revolutions all over the world. We changed the shape 20th century take. But then, based on the experiences of the 20th century, people said, okay, this went wrong, so they make their criticism against it. And this time, the trend is the opposite. And I think that's right. Starting from 1968, there is this criticism against the old left, and then we are turning into, again, this expansion of the horizontalist networks. We don't say party, so these are all leaderless, in a way, movements. And in a way, they are successful in changing the social and cultural shape, in a way, and challenging. But also, I think they are causing an important problem. Because if you look at the 2011 wave of unrest, these revolutions, I think it creates a typical Gramscian situation in which the old world is dying, but the new cannot be born. There's no ideological, everyone knows what these movements are against. But when you ask what they are for, what are you going to do, there's all confusion. There's no ideological clarification about what to do. There's no clarification. That's why always the terms are another world is possible. We don't know what. The beginning is there. We don't know what is going to begin. It's always this problem. And I'm saying that because also looking at what this new left is doing, and in terms of the consequences it's creating, it creates a puzzle. For instance, in the 2008 financial crisis, we saw all of these movements. We saw all of these movements emerging, but actually we don't see the neoliberals actually changing their attitude after the crisis. They are continuing. We didn't seem to make much change. We didn't seem to create some threat. If you look at Egypt and all these movements, we see the revolution is coming. When we look at the consequences, we see that we are not in a way challenging it to create the movement that we want to transform. That's why I think, in a way, the cycle so there are two conclusions, and it's like a question also. It seems that this time in the world, we see a broader base of the revolutions. It's more serious, it's everywhere in the core, semi-periphery, periphery, and there is potential to expand. But also, in terms of the threat that they create, it seems to be much weaker than the 19th century. So it seems to me that the future of the capitalism and global governance will be mostly determined by not simply these movements by below, if it goes like this, but mostly of the new emerging financial centers, new emerging military centers, and the competition between these kind of like the BRICS, China, United States, and others. So I think they will have the more to say in this time in shaping the future. So that's my, these are the kind of questions that I would like to raise to you.
All right, thank you. So you're okay if we open up? Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna collect a few questions, comments, and then give it back to Chris, and then go back and forth, and then Chris can also respond to Shahan's comments when he has give you the back the floor. Pat, and yeah, just get my attention, I'll put you on the list, okay? Yeah, Pat's on the list.
Yeah.
So far
Did you
only
call?
Pat's on the list. Yes, I did. Yeah.
Did you call him?
I did.
Oh, okay.
Pat Lloyd.
I'm sorry.
For people who don't know Pat.
Well, I just wanted to add a couple of thoughts. It's not really something that you really need to even respond to. I was in Berkeley, 1966, 7, and 8, and I was on the West Coast in the 60s. And you made the point about how there were, there wasn't just one thing that people were fighting for. There were multi things that factored into this. And in fact, the Berkeley thing started with Mario Savio back in 1961 or thereabouts.
64.
Was it that late? Okay, well,
Free
I'll go
speech.
with you. Anyway, it was a free speech movement, that's what I'm getting at. And that really kicked things off in a big way. In fact, I remember at Berkeley when all these faculty members stood up and took turns. This is a big rally, actually giving this a poem that was off limits by the administration. You couldn't have this poem. It was too, I don't know, dirty or something. And so they took turns, giving their little bit of that. I mean, there's all this kind of thing going on. I had Martin Luther King there, and what that was all about is they wanted to put him down for president of the United States. They wanted him to run for president and so on and so forth. So there were many things that came to grips in that. The other thing, just to mention on that, and I've thought about this a lot lately, is the cultural aspect. When I talk to people about what it was like in Berkeley, younger people, it's really hard, I think, to get a sense of what it felt like. People were dressing different, people were acting different, so there were certain kinds of cultural clues and so forth that really brought things together, and that's really got to be understood. And I think any movement that's going to go very far is going to have that kind of aspect to it.
Chris was
Okay, yeah, thanks. I was interested in the paper at this sort of central role for the left of these national projects, and so there's the global left, but there's a moment where you get the sense that what the global left has to do is exert a certain kind of pressure on the semi-periphery nations under a certain catastrophic global situation, and that's our best possibility or something like that. And that's interesting. But I'm interested to know too then what role, if any, you see for more traditional anti-capitalist forms of struggle, strikes, debt refusal, these things that are being put forward right now, full employment, even in certain sort of national contexts, which don't have this sort of national programmatic function, but has a certain kind of more diffuse manifestation. And I ask this two in relation to the sort of political focus of your paper. So we're talking about crisis, but we're also talking about economic crisis. And I would like to hear a little bit more about like how you're understanding the recent crisis here and the sort of potentials for capitalist economic crisis going forward.
Magda.
Yeah, I would like to hear from you, how do you see the ALBA countries in Latin America? Because they started a genuine anti-liberal movement from below. However, when they were established more, they became anti-hegemonic against the United States. However, all the redistributionistic policy is also possible thanks the emergence of the BRIC countries that giving better prices for these products. So how is this anti-hegemonic? Is this is not really anti-systemic? Or how do you see the problem?
Have we had enough, or you want to get more?
Well, I've got a lot.
Okay, let's
Yeah.
give you just
Okay. Well, okay. The semi-peripheral development idea, I left out of what was in the paper, and a number of some of the points are about that. The idea here is, looking at evolution over the long run, you see this repeated pattern where it's semi-peripheral societies that actually transform things. They change the scale of things. They're main actors for thousands of years. There's semi-peripheral marcher states and semi-peripheral capitalist city states. They're the ones that change things. What happens in the core is things get all bogged down and new innovations come along, but they're a threat to all the power, to all the investments and so on. But out on the edge, there's some people who are willing to take risks and can do things in a new way. And this happens over and over again. And it's part of the process of evolution. And that it's probably going on now, and the Latin American pink tide was an example of this, okay? Now, is this really anti-systemic? Well, and later we get into all that. There were progressive regimes, there still are, and they are, challenging neoliberalism sort of a little bit in some ways, but not others. It's not revolutionary. But the notion I had about muscle was basically a marriage between the movements and progressive regimes in the semi-periphery. But that presumes that there are or will be progressive regimes in the semi-periphery, and I admit that, they haven't been that challenging of the powers that be, although what they have done is important. Okay, Brazil, yeah, it's to some extent, the Workers' Party, went along with the way the world was organized, but they also created the space for the World Social Forum, okay, and made it possible. So a lot of the things that have already happened have been supported by these progressive regimes. The people in the movements deny that usually because they don't want to have anything to do with states and governments and stuff. But the fact is, a lot of the support has come from Venezuela and Brazil and places like that.
Including Putin's Russia?
Well, the BRICS are a counter-hegemonic phenomenon, and okay, your point was, well, it's not just in the semi-periphery, and of course that's true. It's also in the periphery and in the core, okay, where revolutions are like that. And the real question is sort of, where is the driving muscle coming from? And frankly, I'm not going to be, demand that everything happens in the semi-periphery. I don't think it does. I just think there's an insight there we need to pay attention to. For example, the Germans just voted with the BRICS at the G20. Okay, they didn't go along with the war in Syria. The Germans in the semi-periphery? No. There's interesting things going on about global governance and stuff. Okay, U.S. hegemonic decline is proceeding apace, but there are big problems like the Syria issue, and it's sort of making everybody see what the contradictions of the existing system are, and not everybody's on board anymore with the project, including even the Germans who just voted with the BRICS, okay, at the G20 meeting against the war in Syria. So there's really interesting things going on. Anyway, I'm just agreeing with you that it's not just in the semi-periphery, okay? Bolivia has been a huge player in Alba and so on. And it's not in the semi-periphery, okay? But it was very important in this climate justice movement that I've been talking about and stuff like that. So there are things happening in the periphery and in the core. Spain and Greece and so on are part of this world revolution of 2011, obviously. It's an anti-austerity revolution to some extent. And so there's a second-tier core, and the United States. We had the Occupy movement. Is there a revolutionary situation in the United States? Well, declining hegemonic core power doesn't sound like it, right? But you're absolutely right about the income distribution. Okay, the income distribution used to be like that, but the middle class got hollowed out in the core because of the nature of neoliberal capitalism, and that kind of creates a different situation in the ability to pay people off. And it does create a more interesting political situation, and we've got one in the United States, and the Occupy movement just proved that, okay? It didn't really change all that much, but it showed that there are people here who are willing to go out and camp together for a while and really kind of challenge the basic ideologies that exist. But if you read and understand the nature of that movement, I think it tells us a lot about the new global left, too, the thing you mentioned about leaderlessness and all that, but other things, too. I've just been reading a lot of David Graeber, and David Graeber's smart. He's an anthropologist who was a big leader in the Occupy movement, and I recommend that you read him. I mean, he's an anarchist of a certain kind, but it's very thoughtful and interesting stuff about the nature of, about the ideology. I mean, somebody said, you know, the movements don't agree on much. No, but there's some things they do agree on, and that keep getting repeated, that came out of 1968. This leaderlessness thing, individualism, okay? There's no critique of their way, of the kind that there was in the World Revolution in 1917 of individualism. There's now a debate about which kind of individualism, basically, okay? David Graeber has his own kind, it's sort of social network individualism or something. And I think that, you know, we need to take this seriously. There are basic philosophical problems that have to be resolved in order to have this convergence that I was talking about in organizational terms, but ideology is part of that. And you're absolutely right. People have to have a vision of the future, and it has to kind of be in, you know, Pat mentioned, you know, the feel of social movements. Okay, well, I teach collective behavior in social movements. Social movements aren't just a bunch of people making a rational decision to do. It's involved in feelings and in people who are able to see the world in a whole different way. And I experienced that in the 60s. I'm sure he did too. Okay, it's about the zeitgeist. These things happen. It's collective behavior. It happens. Okay, and it's not. It goes from a few individuals who are doing a couple of things to a whole bunch of people doing it, just like we saw in the Occupy movement. That's how it works. There's a collective behavior aspect to social movements, and we need to understand that both as social scientists and as people participating in social movements. It's about feelings, all right? And which feelings and how those are mobilized and how people conceptualize possible futures and everything are totally important. So we do need to pay attention to those things. What did my... Oh, you mentioned weaker than in 1917. You know, that's why I was talking about muscle. But I will just say there are people like Jackie Smith, who does study social movements, who think the opposite, who see the current world revolution as pretty strong, as breaking out everywhere, and so on. So my understanding, I mean, I have a kind of geopolitical notion of what power is and stuff, but you know, it does come from the bottom, from below. And so whether it's weak or not, I don't know. Jackie Smith has a notion that it's not weak, that there are transnational social movements more than there have been. This is linked to the notion about the internet and social networking and all this kind of stuff. It may be somewhat overdone, but I think you may have something to it. It may not be as weak as it looks. I'll just say. I mean, I don't know if I agree with her or not. She's pretty strong on this. I recommend her book, well, Social Movements in the World System.
Barack, and then attention if you want.
three brief questions. So you mentioned Keynesian policies as one alternative to fix the crisis, but I'm not sure like what kind of Keynesianism you are talking about, because if you are talking about state spending, we see a great expansion of the spending during this crisis, which doesn't provide any sort of like certain fix to the even in the history, in the previous crisis like 1929, I don't see like simply state spending as a sort of fix to this crisis. We need to go to the dynamics of the Second World War and how it ended and how the the rate of profit kind of restored and increased, rather than just looking at some sort of state spending policies to understand the reasons of the crisis and the solutions to the crisis. The second is more it's a point about within the paper. It's on page 6. You say, so you basically define here like this explains why anti-systemic movements were able to attain state power in semi-peripheral Russia and China in the 20th century. So in this, from this sentence, I understand you see China before 49 as a semi-peripheral country. So what is the empirical basis of that sort of diagnosis? And the third is, you say in the modern semi-peripheral class, conflict is not suppressed by the core-peripheral hierarchy. On the contrary, the class conflict is exacerbated because some elites have both opportunity and the motive to adopt policies such as economic nationalism that are intended to move the national economy up the food chain of the global economy, and then they ally with the worker and peasant movements. So here you are talking about an elite in a very class sense, in an economic sense. Because within this paragraph, I see elite as sort of like sort of a capitalist class, propertied class, who wants to adopt nationalist economics to compete with the dominant powers of the capitalist system, and then you say they ally with the workers and peasants movement in Russia and China during their revolutions. But I don't see any kind of elite doing any kind of like propertied elite class doing that kind of work in both revolutions. So what kind of an elite you are talking about in these two revolutions?
It was 3 questions, but I
Yeah.
was thinking 3 people, but then you may end up with 9 questions, but you're okay?
9 questions are good.
Yeah, okay. Dan and then Chip.
Well, this actually ends up building on that, so it won't be that. I was just thinking that, I mean, you're making all these comparisons to the the left movements and these left social movements, but you did the whole project on looking at the creation of a transnational capital class historically. And what does that, if you actually make the comparison to then this sort of global right, whatever you want to call it, I mean, that should be able to give you some indications. I wanted to see what you were seeing. In comparison, to see what you see as the struggles now, if you make that comparison instead of 1848 and those sorts of things, if you actually made it to the creation of a transnational capital class, what does that get you about the nature of the structure and organization of these movements and these developments?
My question is about Keynesianism as well. This, when you are in the paper, when you are talking about the possible trajectories that might happen, and you're saying that if the U.S. hegemonic decline proceeds slowly, you say that the enlightened conservatives will have enough time to reform the current capitalist system and provide a more democratic form of global governance, as a response to the ongoing struggles. But what I wanted to ask is that when Keynes first came up with his reform solutions to reform the system, as an enlightened conservative, he was not actually listened first by the most of the rulers of the capitalist countries, the imperialist countries. So actually, when they only listened to Keynes' solutions regarding the problems of international capitalism was after the World War II, even after the counter-hegemonic movement from communism, and they didn't listen to him, but they, in fact, put into these things into action after the calamity of the counter-hegemonic movement from fascism, actually. So in this respect, what do you, I mean, why do you think this time, without such a collapse of the system, would enlightened conservatives would be actually listened to in a move to a reform system by the governments, current governments?
Yeah. Okay. So the problem about global Keynesianism, okay, never happened before. And it raises a whole bunch of issues about the institutional structure that exists. Would it actually be capable of doing something like Keynesianism on a global scale? And that's a huge question, I mean, especially if you start thinking about the levers of Keynesianism, like monetary policy and stuff. And what we know is right now, what we've got is a more competitive world money situation. The US dollar is still world currency, but there are challengers. And Keynesianism can't deal with that. Right? It's got to have control over the monetary situation. So in order to do global Keynesianism, you'd have to have a world state. And a world state is, global governance with teeth. And it might not be, there are different forms in which it could take. But is that going to happen anytime soon? I mean, the interstate system is still heavily institutionalized. We all talking about globalization and how states aren't important anymore. But states are what we've got, and there is an institutionalized interstate system. We just saw it in operation with the Syria thing. And it's still there. There's imperial stuff, but there's still state sovereignty and all that stuff, and they're all operating together. So there's no institutional capability to control world monetary policy in a way you'd have to do it to do Keynesianism on a global scale. So my thought experiment is something like that would have to be organized. But of course, it could be organized. And especially if it were some kind of federal thing that only did certain things and not others, and didn't freak people out too much. So it's not entirely impossible. However, is it likely anytime soon? Well, I don't know. I don't think so. All I'm saying is it could happen. Now, when do things like that happen? When we're in deep shit, like you said. It wasn't Keynes's idea that created the New Deal, but he had to have the idea and so on. I mean, he did kind of work this out. He worked it out, and then mostly everybody ignored him. They ignored him at Bretton Woods. Right? He went there with all these big ideas and everything and totally got blown away. And you're right, it wasn't, the US was moving toward a welfare state in the 30s, but it wasn't really till after World War II that things really happened, and there'd been a big war, there was Russia and China, all this. And so it takes shove, it takes muscle, and it takes crisis for things to change. You're absolutely right. Okay. I didn't mean to say, what I was trying to say is there are possibilities for reform and there's possibilities for transformation. And the transformation thing takes a bigger crisis than the reform thing does. But they're both crises. And there's nothing pretty about it. Okay, it's scary. What I'm saying is progressives need to figure stuff out so that we can help make a world that the humans can live in and deal with the problems that we've created for ourselves. This is our job. This is our responsibility to do this. Now, are we going to have much effect? It will be like Keynes. Even if we come up with a good model, then nobody will listen until. But then, when things really start whipping, that's when they start to pay attention. And I also mentioned this thing you said about the movements are both progressive and regressive, and there's alliances are complicated, and there's reactionaries, and there's fascism. Okay, there's 21st century fascism. It's not. Some of it looks a lot like the old fascism, like in Greece and stuff, but some of it doesn't look very much like the old fascism, but it's still fascism. So you know, that also drives the left. That's an important part of it. It was important in the 30s, and it'd be important this time around too. It's not just the powers that be and the elites and all that. It's your relationship with other movements. There's a competition going on among movements, basically. And that's what we need to understand. Now, most people that are participating in movements don't think about that much. They're thinking about their movement and so on. And I want to understand that mentality, but also understand how the big picture works. And I think we have a role as social scientists to be able to do that, right? We go to the moon and we look down at the humans and they're doing stuff and we figure it out. And we go down there with them and we do it ourselves. And I do that too, okay? If you want to get arrested, come to California with me in November. We're going to shut down the Predator drone factory. Yes. Do it. They make Predator drones in Southern California. I
They
didn't know
design
that.
them here.
They design them here, but they produce.
We're higher up on the.
They produce the
Yeah,
ship.
but we're higher
higher
up on
up.
the commodity chain.
You know
yeah.
Poway? Has everybody been to Poway? There's a factory there, General Atomics, and the Predator drones. We're not gonna stop them for very long, but we're gonna make a point.
Okay, I got Chris, so then we have all three Chris's. Is there a fourth Chris in the room? I don't think so. So then we have all three Chris's.
Barack, did you
taken
want
care
to,
of.
you were, at one point, you wanted to respond to something you?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, were you?
Sure. Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I asked my question, so.
Oh, okay.
I
About
think I
China-
missed some of your questions
the-
because I didn't
the-
understand some of them, but
Your
I,
argument about the semi-peripheral character of China before
Oh, yeah, yeah, okay.
1949, and the elites that you define pretty much in economic and class terms, what were the elites aligned with the workers and peasants during Russia and Chinese Revolution? Because I don't
yeah,
see them.
yeah, I didn't know, I can't imagine what sentence you're reading that said that, but that second part. China being semi-purple before 1949, I would say it was, but I understand the problem that you're raising. It's a very poor country, it's politically a big mess, there's lots going on. But this is the, you know, the Giovanni Arrighi approach to core and periphery and semi-periphery, which is you don't take a snapshot of something, you look at it over a period of time. And if you look at China that way, I think you could argue it was. Okay, yeah, it was a big mess in 1949 and 1948 and 1946, but it was still, you know, a civilizational size polity that had fallen apart and had the potential to come back together, which it did do. So that it's in that long-term sense that I would say that it does, that it fits.
Yeah.
Elites in Russia and in China, I don't know what I was talking about, except that the leaders of the Bolshevik and the Communist parties were elites. So maybe I was talking about that.
No, it's not about that.
Okay. What was I talking about? I have no idea.
I can read two sentences.
Okay.
On the contrary, class conflict is exacerbated because some elites have both the opportunity and the motive to adopt policies such as economic nationalism that are intended to move the national economy up the food chain of the global economy. I mean,
Right, I'm
So-
thinking about semi-peripheral development in general.
And then you come, the next sentence is,
Yeah.
these elites ally with workers and peasants. So
Well-
people, the Bolshevik cadres and the CCP cadres were not that sort of elites. Of course, they give so much importance for, like, you know, economic policies, etc. But the elites
I think
here,
that
the
the-
connotation is more like economy, more like non-core, you know, like elites trying to resist, you know, some of the
Well,
policies of the, you know,
I
core
get it,
capitalist
I
countries.
I think actually both work, but I admit it's complicated. I think the Russian and the Chinese Revolution do fit the idea of semi-peripheral development in the sense of a leadership group claims to represent everybody and uses national power to redo and I think the United States fits this too, okay? So I'm thinking about the United States in the 19th century, where there's a civil war over this, and one elite group wins, and then it does tariff protectionism and creates the national economy that it becomes the United States, okay? So
But, I mean,
I'm putting both of those in the same box, and I know that
Yeah.
they're not like that.
qualitatively different.
No,
stuff
but
people can-
there's a phenomenon there, which is that semi-peripheral countries, some of them, not all of them, do that, and that creates some of the mobility in the system,
That's
of which
what
there
I'm-
isn't very much, but there is some.
Yeah. The elites of Venezuela is not the same elites of Russia and China, and the whole class composition is different, but that's a long.
Well, that's true, but I don't, yeah. The Venezuelan thing is a bit different, right? It's not so much autonomous capitalist development as having oil, right, that allows for what has happened in Venezuela. Okay, that's where this left movement can come to power and have a big splash, basically. So that's a rather different situation.
And I think in that sentence, you are not talking about Russia and China. You are talking about peripheral countries, and it links to the previous question, the triangle shape. Yeah, I mean, that
In my
based
book,
on-
Global Formation, which was published in 1989,
Yeah.
before neoliberalism and all that, I was making an argument for why you have class harmony in the core and not in the semi-periphery and stuff like that. Since then, a bunch of stuff changed, right? The middle class shrank and all these things. It's a different world. But I think it did have to do with the nature of the core before the neoliberal.
Yeah.
Chris, and then I've got you. Anyone else? Anyone want to be on the list? Okay.
Okay.
Chris, please.
Yes, thank you. I appreciated reading this. You know, I'm an English professor and I'm not trained to think this big. So it's mind expanding to be able to try it out. My question a little bit picks up on something I think that Barak mentioned in passing, which is about rates of profit, and might have been implicit in something Chris mentioned, and I think it returns a little to the question of whether and how there could be actually a new Keynesianism or a new Deal. I guess one of the places from which my angle of vision on your paper was not only that, a humanist reading a social scientific paper, but also someone interested in, like a theory of value in Marx, which coughs up different kinds of questions than a world systems approach does. And one of the reasons I feel not optimistic about either a new Deal or enlightened conservatism or global, like really any of the options you lay out except total chaos, is because it seems to me that if you think about the way that capitalism is obliged to reproduce itself by reproducing the kind of value that makes the system tick, there are a lot of indicators that there's maybe what I guess in value theory you'd call, like a secular downturn in profitability that can't be reversed. And that, more than the difficulties of getting everybody to talk to each other or coming up with the perfect institution, that thing, whether you think of it, whether you route it through oil production or whatever, or whether you route it through the kinds of technologization that means that dreams of reindustrialization, yes, bring new factories to America, but factories that only employ 7 people because computers can do everything else. So, those things make me wonder about whether in fact we're facing a secular decline in profitability, which to me a little bit trumps the questions of institutional organization and factionalism versus people getting along around what we might imagine happening next. So, that's like a different, to think about that means to think about different kinds of epicycles of time and also different aspects of how capital works. But so I know it's really different than what you're focused on, but just as like a thought experiment, I wonder how that would intersect with your kind of research that you do.
Well, I think it is entirely relevant, okay? And it's related to this question about sort of what's going to happen next and when and so on. I mean, the Wallerstein version of this is capitalism is reaching its limits with regard, because of 3 major contradictions that have existed in capitalism for a long time, but it's argued can no longer be solved by capitalism. And of course, he's talking about the next 50 or 60 years, right? That's his time frame. They are high wages, high costs of materials, and taxes. These are the so-called asymptotes, okay? All of them result in the declining rate of profit. Now, the declining rate of profit is nothing new. All this stuff, I just sat on Dan's dissertation, which is about uneven development for the last 600 years. that's what crises have been happening all along. That capital adjusts to them by coming up with new strategies or moving to a new place or stuff like that. So why isn't the current crisis like that? Okay, what is one issue? Maybe uneven development and the rise of say the Asia or something is just the way in which capitalism adapts to the current crisis. So the profit rate doesn't go down equally everywhere. It goes, and there are new possibilities for accumulation if things are done right. So it could be another one of those. That's kind of what I was thinking about with the idea of the New Deal and Keynesianism, that it would take the capitalist, the world elites themselves would have to participate in this, right? They're the ones who could actually make it happen. And everybody else might say, well, you should do it, and they shove them around a little bit to get them going, but frankly, they're the ones that would have to do it. Well, this would be a major change. But, you know, you read some of these people and you think some of them at least are capable of thinking about things like this. I have another issue that I just want to mention, since you mentioned a bit about the declining rate of profit and stuff. It's occurred to me that if the rate of profit goes to zero, that doesn't actually mean necessitate the transformation of economic logic. It doesn't mean it no longer makes sense to invest your money in some things and not others. Because the problem with the reproduction of wealth is putting it somewhere where there's still going to be some later. And even if the interest rate of the profit rate is negative, you're still going to want to try to do that. And the logic of that is a bunch of different logics, but it's a major logic in what we call capitalism.
Aren't you describing a scenario in which capitalism as a whole would be operating at a loss, though?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm saying it could still be capitalism, but be operating at a loss.
For how long?
Well, no, but think about it at the individual level. The decisions that have to be made are where you're going to put your money that's going to reproduce the money, not necessarily improve the money. You see what I'm saying? It's the same logic. In other words, then the issue is whether you're getting, how big is the net loss? Is it 2%? Is it 3%? Is it 10%? And you're going to have the same, you could have the same logic of investment decisions and so on in a situation where the profit rate is below zero. So the notion that zero is the magic number in which everything has to change, I'm just saying, I don't think it necessarily changes the logic at all. The logic depends on a whole bunch of other things. Who owns what, and who has the money, and who's trying to reproduce it, and how power works and how politics works. Okay?
I guess I'm thinking of inflationary or deflationary scenarios in which when rates of profit fall considerably at certain times in certain places, implicitly the definition of what money is also takes a hit.
Sure.
So anyway, I should
Yeah, but that's important. Okay, the definition of what money is that's the political part that is so important, and it's an economic thing too. All I'm saying is the idea which Marxists have had for 150 years that if the rate of profit declines to zero, then everything will have to change. I just think maybe we ought to think that through a bit. I don't know that that's true. I realize that it does change the way capitalists have to think and so on, but you know what? They've already had to change the way they think a few times. So I'm not sure if it necessarily changes the logic. I think what can change the logic is the way in which people conceptualize power and rights and control and democracy and the economy. That can change the logic of things, okay? And we know quite a bit about this because there are successful models of things in the world that work on a rather different basis than capitalism, like corporate or syndicalism and stuff like that. So these experiments exist, they do work. There are alternatives to capitalism. They don't require, whether they require the profit rate or not, they kind of do, because nonprofits have to calculate the profit rate too. I mean, they just don't call it that. They call it their expenses, okay? But the same kinds of calculations are involved about scarcity and allocation and all this kind of stuff, and the same trade-offs. So it's just a difference in who owns and who benefits and so on. So, but that's what I'm saying, those are the crucial things. about property and who gets the returns and stuff like that. Okay, all this is the Marxist lingo. It's all very important, but there's a whole other thing happening now that this doesn't deal with at all. It's not in the climate justice movement. That's called the red part. It's about justice and who gets what and how much and all that. But there's a whole other thing happening, which is that there's too many humans on Earth, and they're wiping out the ecosystem, and some of them are doing it a whole lot more than others. That has nothing to do with the rate of profit, except that the system of profit is just making it worse, and it's making it worse and worse, because now they're making profits on the crisis and stuff. So, but it's a problem that needs to be solved that isn't solved by the distributional justice issue. It's not. The justice issue is related to it, but it's not the whole thing. There's another thing, which is how are we going to take care of the natural system of the Earth, and how are we going to organize that, and how will that be done collectively, and what about democracy and all this stuff? Huge. And it's not dealt with by the justice problem, although it is related to it, because the justice problem just makes it worse, because the people who have been doing most of the polluting and so on are the wealthy people on Earth, and this creates a big collective action problem trying to deal with stuff on a global scale, because the poor people say, wait a minute, we didn't do this, so why do we have to do it? And then that goes around and around. Anyway, this is part of the politics of the situation we're in. We got to deal with this. It's what's different between now and this earlier period, right? We do have to deal with it. It's not going to go away. It's not just a little thing. It's a huge thing, and it is related to the justice thing. That's why I'm interested in this climate justice thing, because it sort of tries to do both.
Your left Malthusian rant got a few hands up.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay, no, it's good. It gets the conversation another round. Yao, and then, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Aaron.
Aaron?
Yeah.
Aaron, and then hopefully, Yao.
I have a different question. So it's addressing the structure of the movements of movements. What do you think of the different the movements in different countries, in periphery, semi-periphery, and the core countries? Do they have the equal status in the networks of the social movements, the global social movements? And the question related is that, what will be the resources for the global social movements? And the third question is also related, is also about, so you showed us the networks of different types of social movements, like the human rights organizations in the essential core. What different types of movements do they have the equal status in the global social movements structure?
Well, I studied the World Social Forum. Oh, sorry.
It's okay. Eric? Aaron.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for the paper and the talk. That was super interesting. I guess my question was following up on I had an earlier question, but I guess it'll be modified by your response to the rate of profit and the scenarios that you've outlaid in the paper. The title of the paper is like The End of Capitalism, or another systemic cycle of accumulation. And sort of the future scenarios that come out of that are like, they seem to me all to assume that accumulation will continue in certain ways. I mean, you have a return to Keynes, you have like some sort of market socialism based on China. You have continued U.S. hegemony, which you don't think is very likely, and then even this sort of more apocalyptic scenario. All of those seem to assume like an underlying accumulation, and I'm wondering what does it look like if capitalist accumulation does stop happening for a while. I mean, I can imagine a scenario in which sort of like a neo-medieval scenario where wealth, the wealth that's not reproducing itself You know, why would owners keep it in a bank or reinvest when they could buy actual material sources of power, right? So this, I guess my question is about the sort of post-capitalist possibility that your paper doesn't seem to, that it seems like it would be enriched by maybe taking into account, and also the sort of forms of I don't know, resistance to that, or what would those forms look like given that kind of scenario where sort of an underlying continuity of capitalist accumulation is not continued. But I guess just to add on to that, you do use the concept of systemic cycle of accumulation, which I think Arrighi, I don't know too much about it, but in my small estimation, he develops in terms of both Bradel and also Marx's idea of capital as an expansive thing. But that's one component of it. The other component of Arrighi's notion is that we should look at it as part of a single historical process. That like systemic cycles of accumulation are interconnected iterations of this single historic process. And it's not like, obviously you can read Arrighi many ways. One of the readings is that you can read Marx and the rate of profit, tendency of the rate of profit to fall into that. But there is this notion of, that's definitely in that, in the systemic cycle of accumulation, this notion of expansion, that capitalism must expand. So I'm wondering, like, what are those, do you see any of those scenarios as possible, or?
Do you want to get help from them too?
Yeah, a quick question or comment that I would wonder, next paper or whatever, but how would you integrate your story about this march of global left unite the front with the story of a march of the global right unite the front? That because things always happen in zigzag backward, forward, right? That intellectuals on the left usually tend to only see half of it, and Marx himself, Ernest Mandel, and to whoever, that always in their reading that utopia is always on the corner, but in the reality, it's always when there's a crisis in capitalism and the post-capitalist possibility that people ambition is usually some nasty thing like fascism and whatever. And now in Europe, that you see that after all this anti-austerity riots and movement, that you see this right-wing party really on the rise, not only in Greece but even in Scandinavian countries and things like that. And in the 1960s, then 1968, what really made a splash in the U.S. might not be the revolting student, but Barry Goldwater and the Southern Strategy Nixon that paved the way for the counter-revolution in Reagan. So when we talk about, or before we talk about this the post-capitalist utopian possibility, that how could we analyze and the relation between the left and the right, and the leftist intellectual is always too optimistic, with the only exception of Gramsci probably, that he not only have the optimism of the will but also have the pessimism of the intellect. So this is my comment question.
Now the floor.
Now,
Unless you did, was that a follow-up on this?
No. All right.
Or you want to break them?
Well, no, the World Social Forum thing, okay, or the social movements. The World Social Forum has been very uneven despite its efforts to try to get people from the periphery and to cover everything. The Middle East was not involved in the process for a long time. They finally had a meeting in Tunis last year, okay? But more as a reaction to the Arab Spring and all this stuff. It's been very uneven. It's basically been Europe, partly the United States, and Latin America, okay? They had one in India. They haven't. East Asia hasn't been that much. It's been very uneven. Okay, but the World Social Forum, I mean, the idea of the new global left is larger than the World Social Forum. That's just one aspect of it, one manifestation of it. The notion is these national and local movements are part of it. And they're different everywhere. It depends on the situation. It depends on the political situation, what's been going on, all that stuff. So I don't deny that. It's a complicated mess. All I'll say is this is not new. This is the way all the world revolutions were like this. There's the local situation and so on. What happens over time though is they get more linked up with one another. And there's an increasing literature about this, the revolutionary Atlantic, okay, about pirates and slaves and sailors and all this stuff. There was a lot going on in the 18th century that was interactive, where and ideas were spreading all around. Joseph Smith spent time with the Powhatans and then went back and told them about these people he'd met who didn't have kings and stuff. And then they had the English Revolution. So weird stuff has been happening all along. It's just more so now that we have the internet and so on. It's a lot easier to connect up with people on the other side of the world who you think have something to do with your problem. And people are more thinking about things in global terms than ever before, and the problems really are more global than they used to be. So that's why Jackie Smith is so high on the idea of this transnational social movements really starting to make a big difference. Okay? And I partly go along with that, but I also see that some of the problems are that you need to have organizations that actually can get things done. And so alliances with progressive regimes and revolutions in semi-peripheral countries. It's not just the BRICS as they are now, but the notion is there's going to be new progressive regimes. It's not over. The pink tide was a wave that interestingly happened mainly in Latin America, not other places. So we need to worry about that, but that there will be new things like that. Okay, that's the idea. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but okay. Then there was the thing about that guy still here. Yeah. All right. One thing. Terry Boswell and I use this idea of market socialism, but it's not what the Chinese mean by it. I mean, basically, they've got state monopoly capitalism, a bunch of state-owned firms. Okay, it's not market socialism. They got some markets and stuff. But the market socialism idea is the idea that it's a commodified economy, and workers are working for a wage, but workers own the means of production. Okay, so it requires an agency, a state, to basically redistribute power, ownership. And then everybody, when they're 18, they get X number of shares, and then they try to invest their shares and stuff. So it creates a market for capital rather than a state making all the investment decisions, which John Romer argues is a better model because it encourages firms to try to produce things that people will actually buy and stuff like that. It solves a bunch of the problems that the Soviet economy had. And it uses market mechanisms a lot. That's why he calls it market socialism. When we think about utopian futures or dystopian futures, a lot of times, and coming out of Marxism, there's a critique of markets and money and all that stuff. This is the source of all evil. I look at these things in evolutionary terms from the Stone Age on, and I see that markets and money were functional for creating larger systems. That's what they did. They're not necessarily evil or not. The issue is the returns to people. But there are other ecological issues. Do we really need globalized production? Or would everybody like to produce their own food? I'm sure all you want to produce your own food, don't you? Or are we going to have a food industry and you go to the store and buy food? These are basic decisions that have to be made. And I know people, I live in California, and a lot of people are thinking about some utopia of the future in which they're going to produce their own food. But a whole bunch of other people, most of them, don't really want to produce food.
David Graeber's work that does change the perspective on markets, though.
That's true. Well, no, but, I don't know which book you're thinking about. The Debt book?
Debt, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great book. But I think he's just pointing out about the power of ownership and money, and I think it's a very important point that he's making. He's looking at how that's worked in civilizational terms, since the Bronze Age, which is really neat, because we usually think of commodification as something that happened recently, but what he's talking about is how it worked in the Bronze Age and how it affected gender relations and all this stuff, which is fascinating. I mean, his big idea is debt relief, like you said, or just debt cancellation, right? Which has happened a million times before, as he points out, and is a good idea now, but it doesn't really answer the question of what do you do after that, and who owns what, who controls what, and all that. So you still need to deal with that, and he doesn't really deal with it, really. He doesn't address that very much. You could try to read between the lines, but there's not much there. I mean, that's my take on it. I don't know who would argue differently. The implicit idea is a utopian idea that humans, well, it's not really utopian, it's a notion about human nature, right? It's about saying people aren't really such assholes. They really are okay. What they really want to do is have fun and love each other. And that it would be nice to have a society that allowed them to do that. And that we're not necessarily evil and want to just torture each other and stuff. So it's a positive idea about human nature, which is based anthropologically. So he's not just saying this in the abstract. And that's good. I mean, it's a good antidote to a bunch of, evolutionary psychology and stuff, which says that we're a bunch of monkeys that just want to eat each other, tear each other's hearts out and stuff. So that part is good. But what it doesn't do is say very much about how the future could actually work. After you do the debt cancellation, then what? And then hold on. Remind me.
Whatever, the right way, that's how you.
Oh, yeah, no, you're right. I mean, what we need to do is see how these things work together, and we should start by looking at how it worked in the past and then try to think about how it's working right now. The problem I see is we tend to use the concepts that we had from the last time around in looking at the present, but we need to kind of open our minds here, okay? But it's the same political problem that Gramsci and all the rest raised about who are your allies and who aren't they and all that. And when do you do trade-offs and how much do you, but that's kind of the question I was raising, except I was also, the Paul Mason book raises this issue that you raised, okay? It's not just, and he raised it too, that what's going on is much more contentious among the movements. There are enemies among the movements, enemies. The world they're fighting for is worse than the one we've got. Potentially.
Worse, the left create a revolutionary situation and the right seize power.
Well, I can give another example of that. Ronald Reagan was the governor of California. A lot of his ideas came as a reaction to the World Revolution of 1968, directly, okay? And he didn't just react to it, he stole pieces from the Port Huron statement, and that's what ended up in neoliberalism. Did Giovanni say something like that? I think he did. Yeah. The Port Huron statement is anti-state. It's a bunch of the stuff that ended up in neoliberalism. So be careful with your ideas.
Pre-fascist Italy and Germany. That's all.
Yeah.
That is a revolutionary situation.
Right.
And the last, and of course they stole ideas from and Mussolini used to be a radical socialist himself.
Okay, this is going to be the last round, so if you want to get in, let me know. Shahan, I'll go in. Shafiqa, Joel. Okay. Shahan, Shafiqa, Joel, and I'll go last with a little comment. Okay. Little.
Now, assuming that we see capitalism as a combination of both logical capital and power simultaneously, right? So, and when we look at the threats to this capitalism and global governance, when the Dutch hegemony was being established in that crisis, all of these religious movements, the Protestant movements, they were not simply social movements, but they also took over the existing states. If there was no state, they established itself. Dutch revolt was also being established, and it happened all over Europe. transition from Dutch to British hegemony, or examples like American Revolution, French Revolution, Haiti Revolution. All of the movements, they also took over the state. From British hegemony to US hegemony, I mean, the examples we give, the revolutions and the US side, they also took over the state. So this time, however, in these movements, so it's not the strength of the movements as social movements, then probably, I mean, these movements might be even more stronger. But then the will to take over the state is, I think, is much, much weaker than it has hitherto been. And that's a reaction, and not simply take over the state in a revolutionary sense. Even in a reformist sense, they are kind of allergic when they see, I mean, even your examples that when you talk about social forums and the, and the world leaders, when they attend, it's all a matter of contention, because the whole idea is now, oh, we cannot, I mean, the dominance, and it can change later on, but the dominant idea is that, oh, we cannot take over the state. And this is also an obstacle for the coalitions that you are trying to establish. For instance, it's not simply whether or not these movements can create a threat, but for instance, if they want to make a coalition with China, for instance, what do you see the possibilities between these world social forums and like China in a way, because it seems to be now it's a very, it is not what we see as the moment, it's not evolving in that way. I mean, the evolution is kind of the opposite, and that's one of the I think, the limits of what's happening. And would you agree with that? I mean, in terms of taking over that? And secondly,
But there are reasons why the movements, this whole anti-state and anti-party stuff came about. It wasn't just a mistake, it had no basis in fact, right? It was a reaction to the nature of the Soviet Union and the old left and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So there's a real problem there. It's the oligarchical tendencies of political parties, as we say. I mean, all organizations, after they're old, become sclerotic and are run by a small group of old guys who are basically taking care of their ass. All organizations. So what's the solution to that? Don't organize anything? No. Organize a new thing every time. Thomas Jefferson said you should have a revolution every 20 years. Okay? He understood this. So it doesn't mean don't organize. However, there's a whole discourse about new forms of organization, and that we got to pay attention to, because that's fine with me if they can be effective and all that. Okay? So I think new organizational forms are a good idea. But the critique, I agree with what you said. This is a problem. It creates difficulties in relationships with existing regimes and with the creation of new regimes, because a whole bunch of the players aren't trying. The Zapatistas won't vote for the guy in Mexico City, right? And this is all over the place. This is part of the new global left, this idea. It's not just a little thing. It's almost everybody agrees on this. So we do have to deal with it. And my thought is, what will happen is you get people who bleed off, and they say, but you know, a lot of things that people point to are right. Okay, in the United States, the Occupy movement didn't do electoral politics stuff. The Tea Party did. Well, we see where that went. What does that prove? Okay, should you be involved in electoral politics in the United States or not? Is it a big waste of time and all that? Well, it is in some places, but not others, I would say. Okay, in Wisconsin, it's probably not a waste of time. There's a lot going on in Wisconsin, has been and still is, and the control of the state there is totally important, and all the issues are there in the microcosm. I don't see a moral issue here. I see a tactical issue. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. And I think that's the way to think about it. Sometimes it does make sense to participate in things like electoral politics. When you can make a difference, when you have a strong movement, when you can do things for the movement. Yeah. Okay, well, you and I are pragmatists, but not everybody is.
Just one sentence question. If you take the whole story of capitalism out of your narrative, what changes?
Okay, don't answer that. I mean, answer it in a minute.
Okay.
Let me just get the
Yeah.
other two in,
Yeah.
and then I'm going to, because we've got 7 minutes.
Actually, my question maybe it may change the topic a little bit, but it reflects on what Wolfgang raised about the right and left, relationship between these two movements in this current crisis period. In the previous period, actually, rights in form of fascism was a response to, although it was a response to the liberal, global regime, it was mostly a response to the rise of communism and socialism. Today, actually, when we look at the world, in most parts of the world, we see that hegemonic, counter-hegemonic movement is Islam, actually, at the moment, instead of socialism, communism, or any kind of leftist anti-capitalist movement. So, do you think this might have any reflections on how you perceive the current relations of, current alliances or whatever that progressive movements and regimes start to make? Joel?
Okay. I like your effort to analyze these waves of upheavals since 1789, every generation or so, or maybe a little longer, and looking at them as global and trying to figure out what was going on globally to make these happen. There seems to be one missing, and I'm wondering if it's intentional, if you just, what you think of what happened after World War II. So this whole wave of decolonization, strike wave across the world, revolutionary wars in China and Vietnam and dozens of other countries, actually, some of which succeeded and some of which didn't. But I think just in terms of the popular upheaval, in terms of masses in the street, in terms of changing regimes, that's perhaps larger than any of these.
Right. So what year should we pick to call that one?
Chinese Revolution, probably 49.
Well,
I'd have to think about it. I'm
I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
A huge wave of decolonization. It went into the 1960s.
And it's not just decolonization.
Yeah,
I mean, there was
no,
a strike
I
wave across the world.
read-
If you look at
yeah.
the article we read of Beverly's about strike waves.
Right.
It's after World War I and then after World War II.
Yep.
And protests everywhere, and it wasn't just decolonization either.
You're
It was a
right.
wave.
On the other hand, from a macro perspective, it could be all one long wave starting from the end of World War II, from 1917 actually. But I'm sorry, I meant from the the middle of World War I through the decolonization.
Yeah.
But anyway, let me. I want to hear the answer to these questions, including what would change if you took out capitalism, because I think that would clarify also where Chris was going with his question. But this is like, I don't know, you had in your talk a throwaway thing where you said that it was obvious, it was fairly unsurprising that human rights was central, because we all agree human rights are important. But I don't know if that was a kind of throwaway line or whether that's your actual explanation for the centrality of human rights. But it would seem that it's actually, if we start looking at who's central there, that in some ways on the human rights, it's precisely because there's big disagreements, and that the human rights initially, as it forms in the 70s, is in the early 80s, is a U.S. weapon in the Cold War, and then in the 80s, and then in response, there's also all these U.S. Communist Party fronts that are about pointing out human rights, the role of U.S. involvement in human rights violations and military dictatorships in Latin America. So it becomes a contestation. It's a concept that's central in the Cold War contestation, and I'm wondering. And at that point also there's states that are putting organizational monetary resources, funding organizations, and so they can afford to be